And welcome back to another recorded lecture. This one is your introduction to Unit 5, which will be on factor markets. And we will get into that momentarily. But first, I want to remind you, make sure you are actively listening by taking notes and pausing the video whenever you need more time to digest the material and complete any practice. And without further ado, I'm your host, Mr. Kamos, and today we are beginning Unit 5, which is a very short unit, and what I think is actually one of the easiest units of the entire course, and hence why you are beginning it asynchronously. But a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about in Unit 5 and you're going to learn, you've already learned, actually. We're just going to be embellishing it a little bit and adding a little more detail and connecting it to everything else that we've already covered in previous units. And so when I say factor markets, I'm referring to, of course, the factors of production, which you will remember fondly from the very beginning of the course in August, that the factors of production are the resources used to produce everything. Everything that we consume, every good and service, every product that a business creates comes from the factors of production. And businesses, no matter what they produce, require resources to produce them. And you know very well that all resources are scarce, and there's no such thing as a free lunch. And so all these basic concepts are going to be coming back as we delve into the world of resources. Now, you could also see factor markets referred to as resource markets or input markets, but I like calling them factor markets, so that's what we're going to continue with. So the good news, like I said, you've already learned this, and it's supply and demand, right? One graph is all we're going to be using to show the resource markets and how the market, and then later in 5.2, the firm purchases and acquires and uses and maximizes profit using the factors of production. And so we're going to be getting into supply and demand, but it's going to be sort of reversed. Okay, and you'll see why in a moment. And so this model, it should be pretty familiar. We're just going to be adding in some new details. The main difference is that in this course, up until now, we have been using supply and demand to represent product markets. And these are markets for goods and services. And so we've been assuming, of course, businesses are using resources. We learned about production and cost in Unit 3. We learned about supply and demand and product markets in Units 1 and 2. But now we're going to be thinking about things slightly different. Because when it comes to resources, businesses are the ones that buy resources, not households. Households or consumers supply the resources to firms. And so in a product market, like in Unit 2, and all throughout the rest of the course, we've been talking about businesses supplying. But now businesses will actually be demanding all the resources because they're using the resources to produce goods and services, which then they will sell in the product market. And so in a free market economy, all factors of production, all inputs to production, all resources are owned by the households. And we learned this back in Unit 1. But this means that households will now be supply and businesses will now be demand. And y'all, this is the biggest point of confusion. Okay, if you understand that factor markets are the reverse of product markets as far as what the economic agents are demanding and supplying, then you will be on your way to understanding the rest of this unit. And so here is the good old-fashioned circular flow model, even though this graphic really is contradictory because it's a square. But it is circular in that firms and households are interacting through two different markets. And so if you look at the market on top, that is the market for goods and services. That is the product market. We've learned about all of this stuff, right? We've learned about how production is performed by firms, how firms maximize profit using resources and managing their costs in order to produce. But now we're going to direct our attention to the bottom, which is factor markets. And this is the second type of market that firms and consumers interact with. So if we review back to, from August, the circular flow model, you might remember that there are payments for all four factors of production. And so we're going to go through those very quickly. Land, we call rent. The payment for land is rent. Labor, the payment is wages. and this is the most the common one used by College Board. And so on a lot of Unit 5 questions, you'll see labor as the primary resource. It doesn't mean that there won't be questions on the others, it just means that labor is by and large the most common. And then we have physical capital, or just capital, or capital goods, which the payment for is interest. And you might remember the reason why interest is the payment for capital is because when a firm wants to expand its factory or expand its production process or its industrial complex or buy new equipment or invest in new technology, typically firms are not going to have the cash on hand to acquire these capital goods, and so they will take a loan out from a bank. And the bank essentially owns the capital good until the firm pays off the loan. And so that payment is interest. And then remember, the fourth factor of production is entrepreneurship. But entrepreneurship is not necessarily bought and sold. Actually, it's not at all. Entrepreneurship is the reward for, or the incentive for taking these three factors of production and combining them and maximizing profit and innovating and inventing something new for society. And so entrepreneurship is not necessarily part of this whole factor market thing, but it is still a factor of production. I want to discuss economic rent, the concept of economic rent. Here I'm not just referring to the payment for land, the payment that firms would make for land. What I'm referring to is economic rent, which is a more general term that could refer to any payment for any factor of production, so not just land. And this is confusing sometimes because, you remember econospeak, economists use words in ways that we do not, out in the real world. And so economic rent refers to any payment for a factor of production. Now, if we're speaking about labor in particular, the economic rent for labor is not just the wage, but it is the wage above whatever the minimum wage that worker would accept, because the minimum wage represents the worker's opportunity cost. But if a worker is making economic rent, that means they're making a wage greater than their opportunity cost. This is sort of the same as normal versus economic profit. Here we're just referring to wages. And so now we can delve into the factor market. And so we're going to build our supply and demand model. We're going to go through it conceptually. We're going to talk about the shifters of demand and supply, and we'll be putting them together. It's going to look all very similar. But I want to reinforce that this is resources. Okay, that, again, the most important part of this unit, I think, for understanding things conceptually. In the background, I have one of my favorite paintings, which is by Peter Bruegel the Elder, who was a Dutch painter in the 1500s. This painting was done sometime around 1560, and it is called Landscape of the Fall of Icarus. Now, I don't know if any of you know your Greek mythology, but Icarus had a father, and Icarus was a creative, sort of naughty child, and always getting into mischief. And Icarus, in the Greek legend, asks his father if he can attach feathers on him with what was then glue, but basically tree sap. And he wanted to fly, and if he attached these feathers to his arms, then he could fly. And his father said no, because if he gets too close to the sun, the sap or the glue would melt, and the feathers would fly off his body, and then he would fall and plummet to the earth and die. And Icarus did not listen. He disobeyed his father and ended up attaching the feathers to him, flew off into the sky, but flew too close to the sun, and the heat of the sun did exactly what his father said would happen, and Icarus plunged to his death. And so the moral of that story is that, this is an asynchronous lesson. We're getting close to the AP exam, and we're talking about resources. We're talking about something that isn't necessarily that exciting, although, we're going to make it as exciting as possible. As usual. But make sure that you're applying yourself, right? I'm not your father, but I am your teacher, and I'm trying to get you prepared. And so life is all about what you put into it. Make good choices. Don't be like Icarus, and you will be successful. If you can find Icarus on the painting, now that you know the story, look around for him and see if you can find them. But I also like this painting, and this is a total side note, but I like this painting because around the whole painting, it looks like a tranquil, productive landscape. We have a farmer, we have a shepherd, we have a boat going out and doing commerce, we have a city in the background with other ships and with commerce and the economy flowing, and all of the factors of production, land, labor, and capital, are all represented in this painting. And so it's interesting that this painting was done in the late 1500s because that was the beginning of what was the antecedent to the First Industrial Revolution, where the Dutch, coincidentally, actually invented so many things that made it into a global economic powerhouse in the 1600s, and then going into the 1700s. So anyway, that's a little art history for you. Let's redefine demand, and we're going to start with demand, but remember, we're talking about firms. Okay, so factor demand is all about firms. And so if we talk about the demand for labor, which we could talk about the demand for land and capital, but we're going to talk about the demand for labor first. The demand for labor is the different quantities of workers that businesses are willing and able to hire at a variety of wages. Remember, that is basically the same as the definition of demand, except now it's businesses, it's firms that are hiring labor. They are demanding the labor for production. And so the law of demand for labor would be that there's an inverse relationship between wage and the quantity of labor demanded. Now, of course, this could be the same for land, or it could be the same for capital. I'm using labor as the example because it's the most common. And so now we're going to talk about the supply of labor. And the supply of labor are households. It's you and I, right? We are the people of this planet, and we are supplying the labor to firms. And so households or individuals supply labor. The supply of labor is the number of workers that are willing and able to work at a variety of wage rates. And so the higher the wage, the greater the quantity of workers that would leave other industries and give up leisure activities in order to join this labor market and provide their labor for the great work of production. And so here we have the supply of labor. And so we can label this as supply, but I'm labeling it as labor supply because we're specifically going to be building the labor market, which is a factor market. And on the y-axis, we have wage, and on the x-axis, we have the quantity of workers. And so this relationship between the wage and the quantity of workers is positive. As the wage increases, the quantity supplied of workers increases. And as the wage decreases, the quantity supplied of workers decreases. Who demands labor? Well, firms demand labor. Households are supplying it, firms are demanding it. And so firms need labor for production. Historically, labor has been the most important factor of production. It is still extremely important. I wouldn't necessarily say it's the most important, but it is extremely important. And the demand for labor shows the quantities of workers that firms will hire at a variety of wage rates. And so, just like before, we have the wage on the y-axis, we have the quantity of workers on the x-axis. Here, I've abbreviated it, but it's still demand, and in this case, it's demand for labor. And so then, as the wage decreases, the quantity demanded of labor increases. So, as the wage increases, the quantity demanded decreases. And so this is the same relationship, the same negative relationship as demand has always been. Now we are just applying it to firms demanding labor. And so now, if we were to combine these two and we were to get the whole labor market, we can think about all of the firms in an industry, all of the firms demanding labor, all of the workers in an industry supplying their labor. And so all of these concepts have what are called demand and supply schedules, which you will remember. And so you don't have to draw any of these tables. Just take a look at these demand schedules. You could see these on a multiple choice question or on a fun sheet. But if we had the industry for fast food, we could say the fast food industry comprises of lots of different firms. And so here is McDonald's demand schedule for labor, right? They're demanding a certain quantity of workers at different wages. Burger King, definitely subpar, but definitely Burger King has their own demand schedule. Then other firms like Wendy's and Pollo Victorina and so on and so forth, they all have their own individual demand schedules for labor. And so what economists do is conceptually we put all of these firms' demand schedules together, and that gives us the market demand schedule. And so consequently, each firm would have their own demand curve for labor, and that eventually, once we combine all of them conceptually, we can derive the industry demand curve for labor, or all of the firms in the industry's demand. Now we can talk about factor supply a little bit more, and so we're going to talk about supply of labor. We already said that the supply is the different quantities of individuals that are willing and able to sell their labor at different wages, and so households provide this to firms, and so the law of supply of labor would be that there's a direct or positive relationship between wage and the quantity of labor supplied. And so I already mentioned this, but I want to mention it again just to make sure you grasp it. There is always a trade-off with every decision, right? So every job that you ever do, every job that anybody does, there is a next best thing. There's an opportunity cost. But more generally, what we can think of it as a trade-off as a whole is that workers trade off between work and leisure, right? So workers can work more and they can earn more wages, but at some point the cost is going to be leisure time. Okay, and leisure has been important for all of human history. I mean, going as far back as the ancient Romans, they called leisure otium. And so otium was very important, but work was also important. And so there's a balance between the two that we have to achieve. And so now we can combine our labor demand and supply. Notice that these curves are slightly curvaceous because of the slide deck, but you just go ahead and draw straight lines. In this example, I've drawn the market for carpenters. Okay, so we're looking at the factor market for carpenter labor, people that work with cabinet making and furniture making and that type of thing. And so this is the supply and demand for the labor. We have a wage of $30 an hour, and we have a quantity of labor. Now, I'm adding numbers to this because AP could give you a question where they provide a wage rate, but generally you would just label this as W1. Okay, so we would have the equilibrium wage rate and the quantity of labor in the carpentry factor market. And so this is a factor market. Now we've combined everything, and we're specifically looking at labor. Of course, a supply and demand model will only refer to one factor of production at a time, and like I said, labor will be the most common. Now, if we apply this information to different types of labor, right? Here we did carpentry earlier. Now I've got a market for surgeons, I've got a market for gardeners, and you know that surgeons are going to be paid a lot more than gardeners, okay? But the reason why is because the supply of surgeons is so much less than the supply of gardeners. There are a lot of other skills and education and requirements in order to be a surgeon, years and years and years of training and expertise. Whereas for a gardener, there is expertise in gardening. I love gardening. It's one of my favorite hobbies. However, if you're a gardener as a profession, pretty much anybody could be a gardener. Or at least a landscaper or somebody that cuts grass or that type of thing. But notice here, the equilibrium wage rate for surgeons is going to be much higher because the supply is so much less, and the equilibrium wage rate for gardeners will be so much more. And so the models look a little wacky because I have supply at the extremities, but really you just have to focus on what is called a wage differential. We'll talk more about wage differentials in a moment. All right, so shifters of resource demand and supply. I'm going to go through a couple of examples first before we actually get to the shifters. First example, let's say that there is a significant increase in the demand for pizza for whatever reason. How would this affect the demand for cheese? And so you probably guessed it, the demand for cheese would increase. Now, if we think about other factor markets and other impacts of this increase in demand, it could impact the market for cows. It could impact the market for milking machines. It could impact the market for veterinarians and vet schools, right? It could impact the market for lots of things related to cheese production, okay? And so that's a great example of resource demand, how the change in the demand for a product, a finished good like pizza, a consumer good, will affect the resource markets of lots of other things. Another example, let's say there's an increase in the demand for cars, and this could increase the demand for lots of other things like tires, like gasoline, like paint for the exterior of cars, like who knows, lots and lots of things. So this is the concept of derived demand, and this is in a different color because it is of utmost importance that you understand that the demand for resources that we're analyzing in factor markets is determined or derived from the products they help produce. And so, of course, if we're talking about the cheese market as a resource, then a change in the demand for pizza is going to impact that resource's demand, cheese's demand. In other words, the demand for cheese will be derived from the demand for the finished product that it is used for, like pizza. And so derived demand will definitely be popping its head up throughout Unit 5. If we apply this concept of derived demand to the market for labor, if you look at this graphic, this is the estimated growth rates of different professions, different specialized professions, and these are the top ones, okay, as of a few years ago. Between 2019 and 2029, these are the professions whose demand are going to increase the most. And if you look at these professions, these are all things that the labor demand is going to increase as a result of the products that these sources of labor are associated with as a factor of production. That demand for the product is increasing as well. So wind turbine service and technicians, right? More green energy, more wind generated energy. We're going to need people servicing all those machines. Nurse practitioners, a lot of old people. The people are getting old, right? We got more old people than ever, thanks boomers. And so we got to have more nurses, okay? Solar photovoltaic installers, okay? That has something to do with solar panels. Occupational therapy assistants, statisticians, home health and personal care is, again, old people. Physical therapist assistants, old people. Medical and health services managers, old people. Physician assistants, old people. Okay, so you see, old people, or the boomers, have a lot to do with derived demand for all of these resource markets, all of these labor markets. Here's the opposite, though. Here's the fastest declining occupations between 2019 and 2029, and you see these are all associated with products that are no longer in demand. Firms are not really producing them, or they have completely stopped producing them. Word processors and typists. Okay, who knows? We might have a time in the future where nobody needs to type because of technology. Parking enforcement workers. That's an interesting one. Nuclear power reactor operators. That's also a very interesting one. Cutters and trimmers by hand, telephone operators, travel agents, data entry keepers. So notice that these types of jobs are related to technological change, right? So how firms' production is changing, the resources they need are changing, the labor skills that they need are changing, and this is structural changes to labor markets. So interesting when you put that together and you compare it. And so here are the shifters of factor demand by firms. Remember, firms are the ones demanding the factors of production. We have changes in the demand for the product. So we could say the price increase of the product increases the demand for resources. That's what we were looking at with cheese and cars. Number two is change in the productivity of a resource. So we could say that there are technological advances in a resource of resources that make the resource more profitable. And so that means firms would want to demand more of it regardless of the price. Number three is changes in the price of other resources. So here we're talking about substitute resources and complementary resources. So what would happen to the demand for assembly line workers if the price of robots decreases? Well, if the price of robots decreases, firms will be able to invest in those capital goods and technology more, and so that means the demand for assembly line workers would decrease. There are also complementary resources. An example would be what would happen to the demand for nails, like hammer and nails, if the price of lumber increases significantly. So, of course, if lumber is more expensive, that's processed wood for construction. Less construction is occurring, so that means the demand for nails would decrease. And so take a moment, answer these 6 questions on the shifters of resource demand. You need to make sure you remember ceteris paribus, which is our fancy Latin phrase for all other things held constant or unchanged. And we are going to go over these in just a moment. All right, so the first one, an increase in the demand for microprocessors leads to an increase in the demand for processor assemblers, right? And so notice here, I just highlighted certain words in blue. The words in blue are the resource, okay? And so this is one of the tricky things about these factor market questions. You have to read them carefully and figure out and discern, okay, what is the product that the firms are producing? And what is the resource that the firms are using to produce the product, the good or service? So number 2, there's an increase in the price for plastic piping, which causes the demand for copper piping to increase. Okay, so notice here we're analyzing copper piping, but this was a change in a substitute resource. And so plastic piping there would be the substitute resource. Number 3, an increase in the demand for small homes compared to big homes leads to a decrease in the demand for lumber. And so, of course, the home is the finished product, and so demand for lumber is the resource. Number 4, for shipping companies, there would be a decrease in the price of trains, which would lead to a decrease in the demand for trucks. Right? So if trains are cheaper, then shipping companies are not going to need as many trucks. Number 5, a decrease in the price of sugar leads to an increase in the demand for aluminum for soda producers. And so if sugar, an input, is cheaper, then that means that another resource, aluminum, that is used by soda producers would increase in demand. And number 6, there's a substantial increase in education and training, which leads to an increase in the demand for skilled labor. And so, you'll just have to practice reading the questions, identifying what resource you're analyzing, if you're comparing the resource to another resource, or if you're thinking about a good and how the resource is related, and just read the questions carefully. Now, there are also shifters for factor supply. And so the first one is the number of qualified workers, right? So, of course, this could be changes in education, training, abilities. Basically, we're talking about changes in human capital of workers, right? Number 2 is government regulation and licensing. So perhaps the government is regulating an industry, and that's going to impact hiring, that's going to impact labor, right? Maybe it could impact other factors of production. Maybe the government decides to regulate AI, so that could limit the use of AI in the production process, so capital good investment, things like that. So then here at my example, what if waiters had to obtain a license to serve food? The supply of labor would definitely decrease because fewer workers are going to be willing to supply their labor. And remember, households, consumers are the ones supplying the resource, or in this case, labor. Number 3, personal values regarding leisure time and societal roles. So here, this is an interesting historical example, and this type of thing happens all the time. We'll talk about World War II first, and then we'll talk about the post-pandemic era briefly. But during World War II, a lot of the workforce, which was male at the time in the 1940s, was sent abroad to fight the largest war in human history. And so in the United States, women entered the labor market and began working, and women were empowered and they were working. And then when the men returned, there was this value about work and leisure time and societal roles of men versus women, where in the 1950s, women were expected to stay home again and not work. Now, of course, some women still continued to work, but this was a huge shift because women had been in the labor market during the war, and so they left afterwards. And so that's an interesting change. Another interesting change that's happening right now, we're still sort of seeing the effects of it. During the pandemic, a lot of people worked from home. And so then people began valuing leisure time more, right? And more than ever before. And the convenience of working from home, and they began to be more creative with what they were doing and how they were working. And so we're seeing, as a result of the pandemic, still structural changes to the labor market that have permeated and are continuing. And so we've already talked about why some occupations get paid more than others, but here I'm going to show you another graphic. These are the highest starting salaries that pay people with bachelor's degrees, excuse me, and you see econ up there. Number 3, applied economics and managerial econ. But these firms, or I'm sorry, these disciplines are in high demand by firms. And so they're going to pay higher starting salaries. But it's also, if you look at these disciplines, these bachelor's degrees, these are things that are not as common, right? Petroleum engineering, electrical engineering, right? That one's not as common. Interestingly enough, public accounting, that's an interesting one. But these are things that people aren't really going to university in as great of numbers to study. So you can think about this in terms of labor supply and demand. And then, of course, here, does having an education mean that you will automatically have higher income? Not necessarily, but and, especially if you're a woman, there's still a wage gap differential. But there is a correlation between education and even going as far back as high school GPA and how much you will earn later in life, because things like your GPA represent the value you place on your human capital and your learning and what you put effort and energy into. And so some of you might be looking at this and you might be like, oh, well, I have some work to do. So it's never too late. All right, so now we're going to talk about wage differentials, because there are a couple other things in the labor market specifically that determine wages, okay? And we've talked about a few of them. The first one is compensating differentials, which is a fancy way of saying that you're going to be paid differently based on something that is non-monetary about your job. And so these are differences in wages that arise from non-monetary characteristics of your job. Coal miners, one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. One of the worst jobs health-wise, right? Because people are in coal mines, they're using a lot of chemicals, the pollution and from the chemicals, and then the dust and everything from the mine is very dangerous. Also, there's risk, right? Being in a mine. If you work night shift, a lot of times you are paid more than working in the day because fewer people want to work at night. Law school professors versus English professors, right? So law school professors are in higher demand, right? They are going to get paid more because they're more specialized, whereas an English professor is not as high in demand, and that means and there are going to be more of them, and so that means they're going to be paid less. International teaching is another example. So as an international teacher, I get paid what is called a wage differential because I have non-monetary aspects of my job that Carol Morgan wants to compensate me for. So having to leave my family, having to leave my friends, having to move to a new country that I've never been to before. All of those types of things are wage differentials, compensating differentials. Human capital is another one. So this is just investment in people. We're talking about the skills, education, training needed to raise productivity of a worker. Number 3 is ability and effort. Number 4 is chance. So chance does play a role. This is very dubious here, but I am the world's best floppy disk repairman. Y'all might not even know what a floppy disk is, but it was used before CDs. Okay, and before so y'all might not know what CDs are, but floppy disk repairman, bad luck, right? They don't exist anymore. Or another example could be for my physics people: cold fusion is discovered tomorrow. That would be amazing. But that means all oil rig workers are now unemployed because there'd be no use for them, right? Cold fusion would totally change things. Number 5 is efficiency wages. So this would be like a business that wants to incentivize their workers to stay. Maybe they've invested in their education, their training, and human capital, and so they want to try to keep their workers in the firm employed, and they want to keep their workers happy. And so this would just be a way for firms to, or this would be firms trying to increase the quality of workers who apply or keep the workers that they have, but that's called efficiency wages. But there are also some imperfections to the labor market you need to know. So a lot of times there's insufficient or misleading job information. So what this means is that there might be jobs available for workers that would be good fits, but workers aren't always going to know about them. And this is not as much of an issue anymore with the internet and social media and all that. But if you change jobs, it's still work, right? You still have to go out and research and talk to people and figure out what jobs are available for you. Geographical immobility. So a lot of countries deal with this, where for cultural reasons or social reasons, people cannot move like distances geographically from one job to another, or they choose not to. So if we talk about Spain, it's interesting, a huge percentage, I don't remember the exact number, but a huge percentage of Spaniards just never move. They always live in the same village or town that they have always lived in. And so they do this because they want to stay with family. They do this because they're happy, whatever. But part of the imperfection here is that they're not going to be there might be jobs that would be good fits that they're not going to be willing to move for. But another aspect is that people could just be too poor to move, which is really unfortunate, because if they're too poor or they're scared or reluctant to move, then maybe they are missing out on an opportunity that would be better for them. But they don't have the ability or the wherewithal to move. Unions, okay, now unions are not bad, 100%. However, unions that are very strong can create distortions in the labor market that would prevent wages from fluctuating, that would prevent workers from moving from one job to another, that type of thing. Collective bargaining is a phrase that you need to know. It means that the union gets together, all the workers, and they threaten to strike unless the firm raises wages higher than whatever the equilibrium is. And so we'll talk more about that later, but maybe in U.S. history you've learned about scabs, which are people that choose to work and not strike. They don't respect the union, all this type of thing. But unions are not bad. It is just that they do sometimes distort the market if they have too much power. And then there's wage discrimination, which is not good. But this means that some people get paid differently for doing the same job just because of who they are. So it could be discrimination based on lots of things, but race and gender are the two most common. They're also cultural discrimination, things like that. But these are imperfections, because in a perfectly competitive labor market, which we're going to look at in just a moment, we can't really capture the effects of that discrimination. And it is also worth mentioning that wage discrimination is technically illegal. Okay, even though it does happen, just naturally. All right, so now we're going to cover the last thing, which is the minimum wage, and we've actually already drawn this in Unit 2 when we learned about price controls. We drew the minimum wage in the labor market. I just didn't tell you that it was a factor market, but we're going to review it very quickly. I want you to assume that the government was interested in increasing, that's a typo, the U.S. minimum wage to $15 an hour, which is a real thing that people have been debating for several years now, since 2018, 2017, they were talking about it. So currently, the median minimum wage in the U.S. is around $8.50, around $9. And it varies from state to state. A state like California might already have a $15 minimum wage, or close to it. A state like South Carolina has a $7.50 than 50-cent minimum wage, or at least they used to. I need to double check that. So here would be your graph for that. We're going to draw the market for fast food cooks, which would be ordinarily paid at minimum wage. And first, we're going to assume that it's a perfectly free labor market. So we have the supply of labor by households. We have the demand for labor by, in this case, fast food restaurants. And then we have the market equilibrium wage at $8 and the market equilibrium quantity of labor at, maybe we could say, 10 million workers, okay, or whatever it is. If the government looks at this market and they say, well, this is a perfectly competitive market, but we want to help workers, we want to make sure that they're getting paid more, we're going to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Okay, because they think that the perfectly competitive market equilibrium wage rate is too low. So they're going to slap on what is called a wage floor. Okay, and this is exactly like a price floor. And it's going to be placed above the market equilibrium. And so here would be the price floor, or the wage floor in this case. And just like Unit 2, you might remember back from October, if the government intervenes in this market, yes, they might be trying to help. But $15, most economists would say, is far too high a minimum wage because of the consequence that this model shows us. If the wage is increased to $15, tons of people are going to be willing and able to work at that $15 minimum wage. And so the supply of labor is going to increase a lot. But the quantity demanded of labor is going to decrease because firms are not going to be willing to pay so much for work that requires so little skill. And so the quantity demanded would decrease, the quantity supplied would increase, and so notice with this bracket we have a surplus of workers. And what this surplus represents is unemployment. And this is sort of a little hint to macroeconomics here, but one reason why unemployment could occur is because wages are too high. Okay, and this is a microeconomic look at unemployment, but if workers see, oh man, I could be the lettuce lady at Wendy's, putting lettuce on burgers and make $15 an hour. That person is not going to have an incentive to learn new skills or to change jobs because they could earn economic rent or a wage above their opportunity cost. And so this creates bad incentives for workers in the labor market, right? Of course, we want people to have a living wage. Of course, economists want people to be able to, make a wage that they can, support a family and maintain their standard of living and all that stuff. But a minimum wage is never intended to be the end-all, be-all, right? Minimum wage is for a low-skilled job that is a starting place, and hopefully, if a worker is able to work and earn minimum wage, that will give them enough income to be able to, gain education, learn a new skill, and find a job that is worth their time and is a more efficient use of their labor. And so here's another example. I'm going to pause for just a moment. I want you to identify the number of workers that would lose their job, or the number of workers that lost their job, and then the number of workers that are unemployed as a result of this minimum wage at $20. Okay, so if we take a look at this graph here, we would say that 30 workers were fired. Right? 30 workers were fired because the quantity of workers originally was 100, but then when the minimum wage increased to $20, it decreased to 70. So 100 minus 70 is 30. However, the total amount of unemployed workers is now 50 because tons of people want to work at that $20 minimum wage, but firms only want to hire 70 workers. And so notice we're looking at demand for firms and supply for the workers or the households. And that is the end of our discussion on minimum wage, on wage differentials, on the factor market, on supply and demand for factors of production. And hopefully you understand now that firms are demanding resources and households are supplying resources. And so I will see you in the next recorded lecture. Take care.